Just going to give everyone another minute to start joining. I'm going to get started. As people start to come in, I just want to welcome you all and thank you for being here. My name is Ariel Morris, and I am the Family Resource Specialist for Early Hearing Detection and Intervention with the Parent Information Center of Delaware. For those of you who aren't familiar with PIC, this organization provides parents of children with disabilities and special healthcare needs from birth to 26 information, support, and skills that are necessary to become empowered and effective partners in any health or educational decisions made for your children or for youth. And I also want to mention that next Wednesday evening on November 2nd, PIC, in partnership with Hands and Voices, will begin a Let's Chat series for parents and caregivers of deaf and hard of hearing children and the professionals who support them. So this will be an unstructured chat about life, triumphs, and challenges, and we really hope that you can join us. And then on Thursday, the following day, on November 3rd, from noon to 1 p.m., PIC is hosting another learning community event on IEP versus 504 plan. So if you want more information, you can join this on PIC's website, find us on PIC's website, or you can shoot me an email and I can help you get registered or answer any questions that you may have. And then before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Hoffman, I want to mention that a survey will be emailed out to all of our attendees after the LC. And if you can take a moment to fill it out, I would really appreciate it. We have two ASL interpreters. The first is Jennifer, who will be interpreting for the first half hour if you need to pin her. And then second will be Milana. And then last, Dr. Hoffman will be taking questions after the discussion on sibling rivalry and responsibility, and then also taking questions at the end of the discussion and presentation. And you can raise your hand to be unmuted, and I can let you speak, or you can put a question in the chat or the Q&A, and I will read it off. And now, Dr. Michael Hoffman. He is a pediatric psychologist at Nemours Children's Health in Delaware, who specializes in working with children with hearing differences. He provides integrated psychological services through the Hearing Collaborative Clinic, with an emphasis on patient-centered collaborative care and improving quality of life in children and adolescents with hearing differences. Dr. Hoffman is also an assistant professor of pediatrics at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University. And now, without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to turn it over to Dr. Hoffman. And thank you very much for being here today.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me okay. And I'm going to try and share my screen. So I'm actually getting a message saying host disabled participant screen sharing. So sorry, give us 1 second. What good would a virtual presentation be without a little bit of troubleshooting? maybe you have an option on your end, Ariel, to give me sharing hours.
Can you try now?
Sure.
Sorry about that.
No, it hasn't. Oh, yeah, looks like it's gonna work now. All right, give me 1 second. All right. Can everyone see the slides now? Cool. All right.
Yes.
Are we okay from a captioning and an interpreter standpoint? I saw a couple questions about that.
I am working on the captioning right now. I'm going to get that set up.
Okay.
You can go ahead and
Okay, sorry.
yeah, you can go ahead. Sorry.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you for taking some time to join in today. I saw a few familiar names and people I know who are in the participants. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Hoffman. I'm Mike, one of the psychologists here at Nemours. And I appreciated the opportunity from Tick and from Ariel to come and talk today. We're kind of doing two mini presentations. One on sibling rivalry and responsibility, and then another talking a little bit more about kind of a language foundation and language deprivation and such. All right, very quick overview. I know that Ariel already gave a beautiful little introduction, but then we will talk a little bit about discussing deafness with your kids, particularly siblings, and then go really heavily into some strategies for managing sibling rivalry, and then transition a little bit more to that second part around language. But we'll have a little break in there for questions, as Ariel mentioned. So very quickly about me, as Ariel already shared, I work in Nemours. I've been here for 5 years now. Started as a psychology resident and then a fellow, and then have been working in the last 3 years full-time here as a faculty member. In that time, I have been working with otolaryngology and audiology to really grow more integrated services for all of our different kids who have hearing differences who come into the clinic. But also, I'm an individual who's deaf. So I was born with severe to profound bilateral hearing loss via connection 26. I was diagnosed at 4 months and bilaterally aided at 5 months. Again, implant on my right side at 28. So currently bimodal. I say all that just to say that I have over 30 years of experience now as a patient, also interfacing in hospital settings and in the medical system, private clinics and such. So I think I have kind of a unique perspective, both as a deaf individual and as a professional, that kind of highlights my background. I think it's always also important for me to acknowledge that certainly as a person who has been a part of the deaf community and kind of grown up with my own experiences, I certainly have thoughts and biases and perspectives myself. And I always try to do my best to kind of acknowledge them and recognize how they may be playing a role when I'm counseling families or working with families, and trying to really make sure that I'm working to support those families working towards their goals and not inserting myself in my own perspective in that way. All right, so let's talk a little bit about kind of sibling rivalry. And actually, first, where I wanted just to start was talking a little bit about just explaining deafness and discussing deafness with your kids, and particularly siblings. For a lot of different conditions, or maybe things that may make a child unique, there may be hesitance on the part of the sibling to have conversations or to bring up questions around deafness in this case or other sort of topics. And that can come from a lot of different ways, where maybe a sibling is sort of not sure what to ask. They worry about upsetting their caregivers or their parents if they bring up some questions about things they're not sure about. But really is super, super important for caregivers to be having early and common discussions that model dialogue and shape understanding of what deafness is and how to discuss deafness. Sometimes parents or caregivers will say things to me like, well, how do we have this conversation? How do I talk to my kid about my child's devices or about hearing differences or deafness? And I always say, this is not a conversation. There's multiple conversations that you need to have. And sometimes I've heard in the past where parents will say things like, well, we tell our other kids, everyone's the same, there's no differences that exist. And certainly, while I can understand the sentiment behind that of wanting to make sure that everyone is viewed and treated as equal, I worry a little bit about that approach, because it also says to siblings or even to the deaf child themselves, hey, any feelings or questions or thoughts you may have about your deafness, or you may have about your sibling's deafness, we're not going to talk about that, because those aren't a thing, right? That's not a difference. That's not a thing we need to discuss. And so it sort of closes the window, so to speak, on having those conversations and those dialogues about what deafness is like. So it can be really, really important that when they come up, to engage in those conversations and have that discussion with your kid. And through that, kind of talking about how you want to explain difference or deafness, how you want to model deafness is really helpful. And so when we have these conversations, obviously it can be good for helping a sibling understand what deafness is. And certainly we want to be open and honest. I always say that if a child is old enough to ask a question, and this really goes for any topic, they're old enough to get the answer. Because once a kid brings up a question about some sort of situation, whether it's their siblings, differences, or wherever it may be, they've already got something going on up there, right? They're kicking the can around a little bit. And if you spend enough time around kids, you know that we never quite know exactly what explanations they're going to settle on or exactly what conclusions they're going to come to. So if they're asking these questions, it can be really, really good to have that conversation rather than back away if you feel uncomfortable. But be open and honest with your siblings and talking to them about what's going on. Be developmentally appropriate. Kids don't need to know all of the nuances and all of the medical components. And again, it's probably going to be more than one conversation. It's multiple. And these can be helpful because siblings might worry about certain behaviors that they may see from another child or from a sibling. They might worry about explaining deafness, especially to other peers or classmates, explaining what devices are if that child happens to use the device. And really, then by having those conversations, you're modeling how to have those conversations with others. And certainly for teens or older siblings, they may have questions about their role in care and their role in supporting their sibling who may have some hearing differences. And they're unsure about how to ask those questions or what questions to ask. So it's always helpful to open the door and have some of those conversations. Be straightforward, be honest, and be developmentally appropriate. I know also certainly through our teachers of the deaf, folks from school, educational audiologists, statewide services and such, there's always discussions around facilitating communication, right? And I think it can also be really, really important to teach those communication strategies that we as caregivers learn for children who are deaf to their siblings, right? And even simple little things like making sure that you get your brother or sister's attention first, using more straightforward and simple instructions if there's a little bit of a language delay, teaching siblings how to praise certain behaviors. So all of those things that we get taught as caregivers or as parents that we use in kind of communicating and reducing barriers to communicating with deaf children, we also want to make sure we're sharing that with siblings. So kind of following that primer, what I want to shift now is to actual specific strategies related to sibling rivalry. And I have this slide here because if you Don't pay attention to anything else I say. If you're enjoying your lunch or whatever else you're doing for the rest of this hour, remember this one piece. And this is very much rooted in behavioral psychology. And the idea here is that we know, especially for younger children, they are not motivated by quote unquote right or wrong or a sense of morality. What really drives behavior in younger children is getting access to rewards and access to things that they want and avoiding punishment. So particularly if we're talking about sibling rivalry in younger kids, thinking from a very behavioral lens, meaning what behaviors do I want to see more of? Cooperation, communication, support, engagement of each other. What behaviors do I want to see more of? And then when I see those behaviors, what am I doing to reinforce or encourage those behaviors? What am I doing to make it more likely that those behaviors happen again? On the flip side, what behaviors do I want to see less of? The yelling, the screaming, the arguing. And what role may I, as the caregiver, be playing in possibly reinforcing or encouraging those behaviors? Oftentimes, as caregivers, we're so focused on trying to reduce these behaviors that we don't want to see. Stop yelling and fighting with your brother, stop screaming at your sister, stop hitting each other. And we're so focused on that we lose sight a little bit of the other end of the spectrum, which is how do we make it more worth their while to engage in those behaviors that we do want to see. And so again, if you remember nothing else, thinking about when I see behaviors that I want more of, pro-social behaviors, good behaviors, what am I doing to make this more likely to happen again? And when I see behaviors I want less of, how can I possibly remove some reinforcement that may be happening? So one of the single best ways to encourage more positive behaviors is to engage in what's called label praise. So label praise is a specific form of attention. And attention is usually the number one thing that kids want. Think about any young child or even older kids. Mostly what motivates them more than anything else is getting attention from their caregivers. It is the most powerful tool that we have to attend or to not attend. And so when siblings are doing behaviors that we want to see more of, we need to be mindful about jumping in and offering what we would call label praise. And good label praise is both specific and it's immediate. We only say that because if I tell someone, hey, good job, as adults, we might be good at figuring out what it is exactly that we're doing a good job of. Kids are pretty bad at inference, especially younger kids. So instead of saying good job, I want to really be very, very clear with my children about what exactly it is that they're doing a good job of. I'm being specific, and I'm going to do it immediately after I see those behaviors. For instance, if your two siblings are playing nicely with each other and doing a good job of turn taking, jumping in and say, hey, I'll use my two daughters. Isa and Maya, I love how nicely the two of you are taking turns bouncing on the trampoline. Or Isa, you did such a good job letting your sister have the ball because she really wanted it. When we use label praise, what we are saying to kids is this specific behavior that you just did, I see it, I like it, I recognize it, and I'm giving you attention for it. And you're almost giving the playbook to those siblings to say, if you do this behavior again, you're also more likely to get more attention from me in the future. And so we're thinking about that balance. We're making it more worthwhile for them to do those positive behaviors. So label praise gives attention. It tells the kid exactly what it is that we want to see more of. And it tells them if we see that again, you are also more likely to get more attention. And so obviously we're talking about this in the context of sibling rivalry. but you can really use this for any behaviors that you have with your kids, or even with your partners, right? So if I take out the trash and it's raining, and my wife turns to me and she goes, "Hey, Mike, I really appreciate you for taking the trash out." She's giving me label praise. I'm like, "Oh, thank you. I appreciate that." This slide here just has some examples of ways to do praise. But what you'll notice is these stems on the left side. So I like it when you, it's neat that you remembered to, thank you for, how sweet of you too. And then we've got these specific praisable behaviors, whatever it may be. Drawing a picture for your sister, putting away the toys, so on and so forth. Sometimes parents will say it gets a little repetitive if they're like, "I love how you do this," or "I love when you do that." And so having some different kind of sentence structures can be helpful. Another form that we can use is what's called the cooperation game. And what underlies this is, and we know from research, the single best way to get two individuals who are engaging in conflict or arguing to be kinder and nicer to each other is to make them work together and make them engage in some form of cooperation. If we put people on the same team and they're working towards a common goal, they are much more likely to be supportive towards each other. And you think about on the flip side, when we have people on different teams, then we kind of grow more of a disdain towards them. For instance, if you're a Philadelphia Eagles fan, you definitely don't like the Dallas Cowboys or the New York Giants. But if I meet another Eagles fan, I immediately like that person more because we're on the same team. So the cooperation game here is a visual where you would have different opportunities for kids to earn rewards, smaller rewards when they get to those dots, and perhaps a bigger reward when they get to those stars. So how does it work exactly? I will also note this is adopted from parent-child interaction therapy, which is a specific form of therapy that's around increasing positive behaviors in kids. It's also been adapted for deaf parents and for deaf children and found to be pretty effective. But you have that board game that I showed you before. And the idea would be that you say to your siblings, "Look, we have a chance for you guys to earn checks or stars that can get you rewards for certain behaviors." And again, we're giving them the playbook. We're saying these behaviors right here, if I see them, you can earn some sort of check or a sticker or whatever it may be. Play well together for 20 minutes, complete a chore together, give each other a compliment, sticking up for the other sibling, saying thanks, comforting someone who's hurt. Again, the whole idea is I am making it more worth their while to engage in these pro-social behaviors and these cooperative behaviors. And as kids are doing those things, they can earn some sort of small reward. So they may get a little check or a star, and then once they get to that red dot, it's a reward, and a bigger reward when they get to that star. And so to just talk about rewards real quick, rewards can be anything that you as a caregiver decide. The second power that caregivers have is what we call the power to make things special. And some of you may have heard me use this example before. If I tell you, do you want my Oreo or do you want my special Oreo? Which one are you going to choose? Obviously, you want that special Oreo for no reason other than the fact that I deemed it special and deemed it so, right? So I can say to kids something like, if you and your sister play well together for the next little while for 20 minutes, then you can earn a special dinner that mommy's going to make. Maybe you were planning on making that anyways. Or we're going to have a super exciting special dance party where we'll watch a Kids Pop video. A reward does not have to be some extravagant expense. It can be anything that you have at your disposal, and using your power to make things special, you can do that. Similarly, when we talked about making it more worth their while to engage in behaviors we do want to see, we're also thinking about that other side of the scale, where during the cooperation game, you move backwards for certain things like name calling, tattling over non-safety issues, hurting each other, mean talk, yelling. So there's an opportunity to move forwards and backwards. And we're totally making it so that they want to do those good behaviors and it's less worth their while to do those bad behaviors. And along the way, as we said, kids are earning rewards and earning prizes. Again, we're forcing the siblings to be a team here to get to an end goal, which is some sort of shared reward that they're very excited about. If you're thinking, okay, well, maybe I've got older siblings or older kids, I'm not super crazy about something like that, or that may not work, you can still take that underlying concept and apply it for teens or tweens or whomever it may be. And instead of in a play session or in the course of the day where they're earning rewards, you can say that each sibling has a box or a jar where they get tokens at the beginning of the week. And that can actually equate to their allowance or some individual reward for them. And then you have a third one, which is essentially your penalty box. And each time one of the siblings is bickering or arguing with the other or doing one of those behaviors we don't want to see, they must remove a token from their jar and put that into the third jar. If hitting happens, you pay the penalty, right? And if they're kind of reporting issues on each other and that tattling is a problem, you pay a token. And then at the end of the week, depending on how many tokens each kid has in their jar, they maybe get a certain amount of allowance or a certain prize. So it's the same idea that we are saying, hey, here's your set pot or your set amount that you're starting with. And if you are engaging in positive behaviors, you keep that pot. And this can be a little helpful for older kids where you can customize the rewards for each of them. And you can stretch out the amount of time that they're earning in because they're able to delay gratification for longer. Another thing that can be really, really helpful, especially for siblings when we've got one kid who is deaf or deaf plus or really has any other kind of additional needs that take up time, is to make sure that your typically hearing child is getting some individualized time as well. And I know it's super easy for me to say that as a professional, like, yeah, make sure you're giving time to your other kid too. But this doesn't need to be a super long, lengthy time that's spent, but it can really be something as simple as 5-10 minutes, and maybe once a week or a couple times a week where you take your typically hearing kid and you have some regular separate time one evening in the mornings or at night, maybe after the younger one goes to bed, sometime like that where it's you and the child. And again, you let them pick an activity that they want to do with you. And they get to lead the activity, they get to be in charge, and they're getting that mommy and me time or daddy and me time or grandma and me time, whomever it may be. And they're getting to fill their cup in that way. So even if you're carving out a small amount of time where it's just you and maybe you're typically hearing sibling, that can still be really helpful for them where they get those moments between the two of you. And again, the branding piece comes into play, right? So we will do this, my wife and I do this with our own daughter who's 2.5, and we've got a younger one who's about to be 6 months. And so certainly she's getting less mommy time right now because mommy's focused on breastfeeding the baby. And so sometimes we'll say to Issa, do you want to have special mommy and Issa time? And she'll be very excited about it. And she even asks for it sometimes, right? And it makes that transition for my wife to go upstairs and start putting the baby to bed easier. And even sometimes Issa will turn around and say to me, hey, daddy, can we have, daddy and Issa time? So that can be really, really helpful, especially if one sibling feels like, hey, this other kid is getting a lot more time, or you as a parent are feeling a little guilty about it, right? We do hear parents say, yeah, I do have to spend more time on one sibling than the other because of their needs. And I feel bad about it. I feel like my other kid is getting the short end of the stick. And so it doesn't have to be an exactly 50-50 time split. It's really the quality of that time that matters more. Again, I am stealing this from the PCIT world. But if you are doing special time with your younger kids, there's a way that you can do it that involves what they call pride skills. And I'm sure if you Google this or look this up online, you can find multiple visuals and iterations of this. But it involves 5 certain behaviors that are praise, reflecting, imitating, describing, and just having fun, enjoying it. And this really runs from kids 7 and younger, where the idea is that we're praising certain behaviors. I like the way you're playing gently. You have a wonderful idea for this picture. You're getting so good at building. We're engaging with them. We're giving them lots of attention and lots of reinforcement. We're reflecting what our kid says. So the kid says, I did it all by myself. You say, yeah, you did it all by yourself. Or I drew a blue flower. Yeah, you did draw a blue flower. So again, I'm paying attention to you. I'm engaging with you. We're imitating their play. We're letting them take the lead. We're not giving them, this is a really big piece. We're not giving them commands, demands, questions. We're not putting any load on them, so to speak, where we're asking them all of these things. As parents, we're sort of hardwired to want to teach. And if you pause and count in the span of a briefer interaction with your kids and say, how many times you actually ask questions or put demands on them, it is a lot. So holding off on questions, holding off on commands, and just letting them lead. Describing what they're doing almost like you're a sportscaster or an announcer for some sort of event, and being genuine, having fun. And certainly this may not work for your teen or your tween, where you're sitting there praising them and reflecting, but even saying to them, hey, let's go have some time, it's just you and I. Do you want to get ice cream? Do you want to go for a massage? Do you want to go to a park? Do you want to watch a show together? But just making that space and that time and letting the other sibling lead can be really helpful. So to come back to what we started with in the beginning, and again, if you do not remember anything else, always, always, always asking yourself, between my siblings, is this a behavior I want to see more of? And if so, am I making it more likely that they do it again? How do I reinforce that? Catch them doing good. Or is this a behavior I want to see less of? How do I remove some of that attention or remove some of that engagement? And certainly what that can involve is a lot of planned ignoring, right? So long as there's not a safety issue or harm, trying not to jump in and sort of yell or redirect every time a kid is doing a behavior that we don't want to see. And in the end, we are stacking the deck so that's more worth their while for the siblings to engage in behaviors that we do want to see than it is to engage in behaviors we don't, by forcing them to work together to earn prizes, earn rewards, or rewarding them in some way for engaging in those positive pro-social behaviors. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, and we can open it up for some questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Oh, we're going to switch interpreters. So Milana is now the interpreter. And then I have a question from Pamela. Pamela, I just allowed you to gave you the ability to speak now if you want to ask your question. You can unmute Pamela if you want to speak. I'm not sure, or if you want to put the question in the chat, I can. Okay, so if anybody else, I'm not sure what happened with that question, but Pamela, if you want to put it in the chat, let's see if I can. Oh, here we go. So she is asking if there is an age gap. Can you speak on that?
Sure. Do you have a rough idea of how large of an age gap we're talking?
Do you have the ages? 9 years. She just wrote 9 years.
9 years, yeah. So that is certainly a large gap. And that can be really hard. So I think it would depend. I'm assuming that the younger one may be the one who has who's deaf or who may require some more support or attention. But in those cases, I think still certainly making that time for the older one to still be a kid and not be forced into that role of caregiving or playing the role of sort of a third parent or a caregiver can be really helpful. And giving them the space to talk and ask their questions or say what they want, I think can be really helpful. On the flip side, that older kid may really, really like being someone who's involved in care and who wants to help out with their younger sibling and supporting them in some ways. And so certainly reinforcing that or encouraging their role to do some of those behaviors. I mean, I guess if you've got a 9-year age gap, you maybe do need that older sibling to help out at times, making some assumptions. And so, again, thinking about what do I kind of need or what is helpful from that older kid, and then how do I sort of make it more worth their while or reinforce when they're doing that, right? So if they're helping out, taking care of their younger sibling, if they're playing a role in that, trying to be mindful of acknowledging that, praising that, and maybe possibly offering some sort of small reward or payout in that way can be helpful. It's hard to be super specific without a whole lot of context. It's a good question.
Does anybody else have a question? You can put it in the Q&A or raise your hand. I would like to say, Mike, that I actually really appreciate this topic because of my 2 daughters, one with typical hearing and one who is deaf. And I've always felt the need to make up to my typical hearing child. All the time I spent with my daughter who is deaf and who had so many appointments, and I had to take her constantly to speech therapy or to the audiology, and it's always a topic of conversation in our house. We always try to be advocates for her, maybe even to a fault. So I really do appreciate this because it really does hit home, personally for our family.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And yeah, I think, going back to Emma's question, where we're talking about an older sibling, it can be hard. And I think as adults, we're probably a little bit more focused on the equity, meaning, the time split. Is it want it to be 50-50, right? Ideally, as parents, we're giving equal time to all of our kids. And sometimes that may just not be the case, especially with a child who has a whole lot of appointments and you're going back and forth to the hospital. And so that's where I would really lean heavily into just saying, hey, this time, maybe once a week, it's just you and I, we're going to go do an activity together. This time is yours. It's protected. And I'm going to make sure I protect it. I'm going to make sure I stick to that. And even if it's not an equal split of time, still that can really, really be helpful for an older sibling or any sibling to kind of feel like they're still getting some of theirs. Or involving them in decision making and letting them maybe pick an activity or things like that at home, and trying to center them at different times. It's not going to be perfect all of the time, but hopefully it can help. And kids are really resilient. They don't need all of the things all the time, but just giving them some of that quality time together can really go a long way.
Great. Yes, thank you. And Pamela did specify, I just missed this, her younger child is deaf, the older child is having difficulty navigating. Now the huge shift to the deaf hard of hearing worlds, that is a heavy focus on the family, which does play into what I said too, Pamela. It is tough. It's really hard when that happens, for sure.
Yeah, and what we haven't touched on, but may also play a role there, is even some of, you mentioned like cultural components of being part of the deaf community, right? If you as a family are learning ASL, learning sign language, making sure that your sibling, your older kid, is also getting an opportunity to do that, involving them in maybe like games or opportunities where you go practice your ASL. You can have voice off times where you go supermarket and you practice your sign, right? Or going to, hopefully now we're getting to do them more as we're kind of working our way through the pandemic, social events, right? And being a part of that community. But certainly just because a kid may be typically hearing doesn't mean that they can't also learn to be a part of the deaf community too, or hopefully eventually become an ally and advocate in that way.
And I have one from Kristen. She said, I'm sorry if you mentioned this, but what if I feel like I'm struggling and need additional support finding a balance parenting my child? Where or to whom can I go to for support? Do you know of any support groups for children?
That's a great question. Certainly, without plugging myself too much, there's always the opportunity to reach out to myself, and I'm happy to meet with any families and work with them. You don't have to be an audiology patient here in Nemours for me to be able to work with you. There are lots of, PCIT is another one, which is great that I mentioned as a therapy that's really, really good about improving a parent-child relationship. That can go a long way, and it's been adapted for deaf families. The beauty of PCIT is that it's pretty heavily structured and standardized, and you get a lot of live practice and reinforcement in that way. And PCIT.org has all of the national providers who are certified listed. Also, certainly reaching out to places like PIC or talking with your local school board or IEP team or child study team about any possible groups can be helpful. Yeah, it's a good question, Chris.
Okay, I think that was it for the questions. Thank you. And yeah, if you want to continue on, I'm going to mute myself now.
Sure. All right. I think I got out of it by accident. It was giving me a double screen. Hold on one sec. Okay, so now we're going to shift topics a little bit into kind of a language foundation or language first foundation. And talk about that. Certainly this could be something that we spend the entire time talking about. It could be a very long presentation in and of itself. But share my screen again. All right. We're good again with being able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So what I wanted to start with is actually the opposite of the language first foundation, which is some newer research that is coming out about a term that's called language deprivation syndrome. Some of you may or may not have heard of this, but what it refers to, and here's a definition from a recent paper in 2020, language deprivation occurs when there's a lack of access or full access to a natural language during the critical language development period. And that's really that sort of 1 to 3 age range where the brain is most primed and ready to be getting language. And certainly that foundation starts when they're even younger. It's crucial in the first 5 years of life that children and their developing brains have exposure to some language, particularly to make sure that we are taking advantage of that sensitive period for language development, where the brain is really, really craving and wanting that input, or in other words, is primed to learn a new language very fast. Certainly, we've all experienced as adults, when we get older, our ability to pick up a new language deteriorates quickly. And we've seen that for some kids, if a formal language isn't acquired by age 5, it's hard to play catch up. If we don't have that language base in our brains, catching up is really difficult. And I want to be very, very clear and straightforward. When I say a language, that does not mean speech or spoken language. It means any language, including ASL, BSL, or any other visual or sign language that may be out there. Or some of those other kind of in-between ones that we'll talk about in a second. The way that I've always understood this is a little bit of a thought experiment, which is if you try and imagine what the dialogue or the conversation in your head would be like without having any language. Take a second and just think on that. If I don't have any language, what is that sort of inner voice or inner conversation like? I have no idea. I still have no idea, and I thought about this for a really long time. So if you take a kid who's 7, 9, 11, and say they were profoundly deaf and they never developed either spoken language or access to sign, and they don't have an ability to communicate other than gesturing and kind of informal sign, home sign, that cognitive ability to express their thoughts, their feelings, to understand their environment and their world becomes really stressed. And it's almost impossible to catch up without some sort of a long-term impact. So we know that individuals who have language deprivation syndrome may have things like language disfluency, meaning their ability to use language isn't quite as smooth, gaps in knowledge, disruptions in thinking, mood and behavior, general delays in development, academic skills and literacy. Obviously, language is something that undercuts everything. And so language deprivation, as we've come to think more recently, and certainly more of the research has shifted in this direction, language deprivation is not, language deprivation and not hearing loss is really the underlying cause of a lot of poor outcomes, both from language, educational, and health outcomes for deaf individuals. And certainly that includes the intersection of deaf individuals with our society, supports, accommodations. So it is not being deaf in and of itself that causes some of these marginalized results. It is really the lack of access to some sort of language. And so obviously there's been a long-standing major debate. I assume everyone who is on this presentation has at least some working knowledge of some of these issues about whether or not exposure to ASL interferes with spoken language development. Historically, that's been one of the biggest worries, right? That if we take a kid who gets a cochlear implant and we expose them to ASL, that is somehow going to impede or interfere with their ability to learn spoken language. The research doesn't really seem to substantiate that. So actually, kids who sign and have an implant tend to demonstrate better speech and language outcomes than non-signing children with implants, and at a similar level of kids who are typically hearing. And I know that many would argue that some of this thoughts against exposure to ASL has its roots in autism, and the sense that, you know, being a part of the deaf community or learning ASL is somehow bad or negative. And generally speaking, from a neuropsychological standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, we know that if you take a kid and you expose them to some form of language, again, ASL, English, Spanish, Arabic, it doesn't matter what it is, they're getting an exposure in a language base, then they're likely to do well over time. And it goes back to that idea of like, what do you think it's like in someone's brain if they do not have access to language? How are they able to talk, communicate, express their thoughts, express their mood, understand the world that they're functioning? The slide's got a lot going on it, and I'm not going to work through all of it, but certainly there's a whole spectrum of different types of languages. And it's not that ASL and English are some sort of separate dichotomy of one or the other, but there's a whole different spectrum of different forms of language, from ASL, sign English, seeing essential English, signing exact English, Rochester method, cued speech, written English, spoken English. so on and so forth. And generally speaking, we know that when we give kids a strong language first foundation, they can do really, really well, and that doesn't impede their ability to acquire other languages over time. And it also makes me think of a joke that I had heard when I was younger and traveled out of the country for the first time, which is, what do you call someone who only speaks one language? The answer in the joke is American, because really outside of the US, most children are raised with a bi, tri, quadrilingual environment, right? Especially if you grow up in places in Europe, you might hear 3, 4, 5 different languages, and it's totally common to be able to bounce across them. So having some sort of language base and exposure to multiple languages can be really, really helpful and protective for people in terms of their cognitive development and their overall academic and everything else as they get older. I also want to say, and again, this is kind of reinforcing what we saw with that, right? But in terms of environments, you can have kids who are enrolled in listening and spoken language programs, bilingual, bicultural programs, schools for the deaf, maybe ASL classrooms. You can have kids who are in pull-in or push-in, pull-out services in various school districts. There are a lot of different methods in which kids are exposed to different languages. Certainly for kids who are deaf plus and maybe have other challenges going on, sometimes we're talking about things like augmented communication, where those kids aren't showing necessarily the ability to acquire a visual language or a spoken language, but they're able to do it with something like an iPad. Even in that way, having a language foundation is giving those kids a better opportunity to express their wants and needs and communicate with those around them. It is important to acknowledge, and I hope I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, that one size does not fit all. And certainly the intersectionality and the context of every kid, family, environment, home matters. And so, you know, obviously the deaf population is not a monolith. I am deaf. There are people who don't wear any devices, who don't use spoken English, who sign. They're also deaf. There are people who use both. There are people everywhere in the middle. There's a ton of diversity that exists within the deafness population. And so I think it's really, really important that we have to consider the context and the intersectionality when we're talking with families and supporting them, and really make sure that we are not preaching an ideology over the individuals. And so as a professional, especially for myself, in my role here at the hospital, I meet with all of the kids who come into our cochlear implant program who are candidates. And my goal, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, is to really make sure that I am supporting all of those families in helping them achieve their goals and what they want. And that includes me acknowledging my own biases or my own perspectives. And certainly, so the way that I think about approaching that is to help caregivers be as informed as possible to be able to make the best decision that they can for themselves. And that includes being aware of some of the barriers and challenges and logistics that may exist. I use myself as an example. I was born in a middle upper class suburban community. I had 2 parents in the home. I never had issues with transportation or housing stability. Certainly, I'm a white individual. And so I never had to experience medical mistreatment, as far as I know. And so, you know, if I needed something, if something was wrong with my devices, I could hop in the car and go to the audiologist. Or I lived in an environment where I had more resources in school to be supported. And so you have to really, really consider all of those things when we're working with our families and trying to help them figure out what is best for them. But it also come back to that idea around a language foundation of talking to parents and helping them understand that even if their kid has some sort of hearing difference, giving them a language foundation is really, really important, right? And so how do we help you as a family create a language foundation for your kid in a way that is feasible and manageable for you as parents, or whomever the caregivers may be? I always say to families, super, super easy for me to say, do this, this, and this. it's way harder to go out and do that, right? And so we really have to be mindful of that. I also put, it can be confusing because and that's why I have this picture here, there's a lot of hands in the cookie jar, right? We've got, you have different services, different organizations, you've got providers at hospitals, you've got statewide services, you've got organizations like Hands and Voices, you've got IFSPs and IEPs, you've got community individuals. It's a whole lot of people who have their hands in the cookie jar in communicating with families. And I assume goodwill and good intent from all of those individuals and trying to support families, but there's a lot of different perspectives and information is being thrown at families to try and make a decision about what's best for them and for their kid. And it can be really overwhelming, I'm sure. So, like I said, we could certainly go on about this topic over and over for multiple hours. I know there's way more nuance than I even have the chance to touch on. But it certainly does seem to be, as a whole, from the research, we're seeing more and more that language deprivation is a really big issue. And we know that there are a lot of variable outcomes for kids when they have different devices. And so thinking about really how do we help families and kids have a good language first foundation to give them the best chance at all of the outcomes that that family wants is important. All right. We have a whole 3 minutes, but I'm also happy to stay on a little past that and answer any questions. But I also have my contact info here. Please, please, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, or if anyone ever wants some support or help, I'm always happy to meet in the talk.
Thanks, Dr. Hoffman. That was really great. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to put in the chat or the Q&A that I can read off? Or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Because I know I saw some reactions. I saw some hearts floating when Dr. Hoffman was giving his presentation. Oh yes, okay. I have something coming in. Okay. James said that this is really helpful.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, I think it's just it's a tough topic because, you know, parents are so invested in obviously in their child and they want the best for them, but sometimes there is no standard for the best for every child. I mean, it depends on it's every child has a unique situation.
Yeah.
So there's no right or wrong answer. A lot of the time it's just you have to know, right, what's best for that particular situation.
Yeah, it is. I mean, when I think about the amount of information that parents have coming at them when they first learn that a child is deaf and trying to engage in decision making is exhausting, right? And that doesn't even include if we're talking about something like an implant, but even just various school supports or placements in that way. And so it makes me very thankful that we have services like the PIC or statewide services or Hands and Voices. I know Mindy has worked really hard to set up the Deaf Mentor program, where we have folks who are able to help out and guide families. But I think no matter how many wonderful people we have involved, it is still always going to feel like it's a lot. And we want to do everything we can to empower parents to make the best decision. And that's hard.
Absolutely. It is a lot of information and it can feel very daunting as a parent in that position. It really can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, and that doesn't even include the emotional experience of kind of learning about the deaf child and navigating that too, or
Absolutely.
just deaf culture in general.
Absolutely. Yes. Caitlin also says, thank you for sharing this information with us. Okay, so if anyone has any questions later on, you can send them directly to Dr. Hoffman, or you can send them to me, excuse me, and I can send them over to him. If you would rather speak one-to-one, he would definitely be willing to do that. So if you can take the survey, that would be great. Oh, wait, sorry. Sorry, I have a hand raised before. Okay. I'm allowing you to talk. Hopefully this works. Nope. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so please take the survey if you can, and thank you. This was great. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.